TFM.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Saddle Up, our dedicated Star Trek Strange New Worlds podcast. I'm Christopher Jones, and with me, as he always is my esteemed co-host, Matthew Rushing. And Matthew, I gotta say, ain't no party like a landing party.
Well, because landing parties do stop dead in their tracks when you can't remember what you're doing?
That's exactly right. Not the catchiest lyric ever written, but true.
That's the worst
very
song
accurate.
ever.
All right, everyone. We are going to talk about the fourth episode of Strange New Worlds Season 2 today as we continue our journey through Season 2. This is Among the Lotus Eaters, and here is a very quick rundown. Returning to Rigel VII 5 years after a disastrous planetary survey, the Enterprise spots the Starfleet Delta from space. Pike, La'an, and M'Benga beam down to discover Pike's former yeoman, Zac Nguyen, who was believed to have been killed in action, now ruling over the indigenous Kalar as king. Soon, due to exotic radiation, the landing party begins to lose their memories, a problem that soon extends to the ship in orbit. Only ore from an asteroid and the sheer will of Erica Ortegas can save the day. So that's it, Matthew, and I have to say, Exotic Radiation, excellent name for a band.
That really does sound like a Star Trek band. Maybe they should have been on like the NX-02, just in the...
Playing in the mess hall?
Yeah, playing in the mess hall. We could have had songs we could sell on iTunes, and...
Well, I mean, we would have gotten a 5th, 6th, 7th season of Enterprise if they had done that.
I mean, of
because
course.
That was the only thing missing to boost ratings on the show.
Exactly. I mean, every ship of only 80 people needs a band in the mess hall playing. It makes so much... Anyway...
All right, Matthew, I think that our bodies have been overtaken by Organians who were former Paramount UPN network executives.
It's funny, we just watched that episode, my wife and I, in our because we've been watching that show in season 4, and we just saw it, so observe her fact. But Chris, in all seriousness, this episode finally maybe answers some kind of timeline question, at least for Strange New Worlds and where it's set, in the sense that this definitely seems like it has to be a sequel to The Cage in some ways. And then what they referenced in the episode was before The Cage, hence why we see Rigel VII in The Cage. And so I'm guessing that's the timeline. But it was interesting to get an opportunity to go to this place that we had seen in The Cage. We also have obviously reference in like Star Trek 5, I believe it is, where Kirk talks about moons over Rigel 7. And I think it's mentioned in some, even Picard, as well as
where
TNG.
They were on the mission where they did the codec that they use in Picard season 3 at the beginning, right?
So, I think absolutely, this... again, regardless of where this falls in the timeline, if it's an alternate timeline or whatever, I mean, this kind of gives us an opportunity to be able to do something as, we were just teasing about Enterprise. Enterprise did that, right? Where it would introduce us to places that we had heard of, but we'd never really gotten a chance to visit or really see in action. And so this episode does that. We finally get the opportunity to actually go to Rigel 7. And it turns out, beforehand, it was not a place you wanted to go.
Right. Yeah, exactly. No, I love the fact that they did, and this was written by our friend Kirsten Beyer along with Davy Perez. And I really like the fact that they did go pick back up an element from the original series and build on it, because it makes sense with Pike and with Strange New Worlds being a continuation of that crew, even though the composition of the crew might be a little bit different. It's something that this series can do in a way that all the other series couldn't do because of that connection. So it was really a nice idea. And it does, like you say, give us some indication of where we are on the timeline and how many years we are from events that we already knew. And in the cage, we're seeing flashbacks to the Rigel VII that the Telosians are showing. But another thing I found interesting about this is the presentation of the story itself, especially visually, and how that might fit into the TOS feeling of the story, because I believe that they did use, whereas in the original series you would have a soundstage or you might have matte paintings in the background, something like that. It seems here they used maybe an AR wall, something behind
absolutely.
them.
Yes.
And it's pretty obvious. I saw a comment in social media somewhere where someone said Rigel VII, I don't remember who said it, someone said Rigel VII is one of the most beautiful planet designs ever in Star Trek, and the production value is extraordinary. And I was thinking, really? Because for me, I really felt like they were trying to save money in this episode by using a wall. And it really felt like the actors are standing on a stage together, and this is just being dropped into the background. But I like the feeling of it because it felt like an original series episode. I almost feel like it was done in a sense on purpose, maybe to bring back that feeling.
So I know that they use their own version of basically the volume, which is what the Star Wars uses for a lot of its shows, specifically made famous with The Mandalorian, right? And so they use it all the time. And I think that there are places where most likely you don't necessarily realize it's being used. It's used in engineering, specifically on the Enterprise here, and they use it in many other places as well. I think this is the episode where I felt it the most. I think
definitely.
that the opening episode of the season, you could also tell that a little bit. But the way that the stage itself had the big pillars and everything, it kind of obscured the background more so. Here, by creating this beautiful, expansive landscape, which is gorgeous. It looks like it's almost based on, kind of like the Dolomites in Italy. Very reminiscent of kind of what you saw in the movie Solo. And the beautiful sunsets and everything they're creating with the purples, hues, it's all gorgeous. They're right in that sense. But I think you're also rightly pointing out, you can very much tell that we're on a stage that's being digitally then extended through a screen. And I think, and I don't know, but I do also think that there... Sometimes, old school special effects in the sense of what we consider old school now, of just like having the green screen, allowed them actually to create depth better than these screens do. They do a good job, but they can't completely replicate the way you'd want always, especially when there's just not a lot else on set. When you're just having rocks and some snow, it's very difficult to really make everything feel like a true extension. And so otherwise, I get what you're saying, but yeah, I think in some ways, it can kind of work to the benefit of the story, because it does kind of have a very TOS feel to it. Like as if, if TOS had the technology now, then this is the type of stuff we might have seen. And so I like that a lot.
It just feels to me like I know they're capable of creating an environment that is much more detailed and sharper and feels what we would consider more realistic, because, like you're saying, they've done it on this show. They do it on other shows that many of us watch. And the fact that here I really felt it, like, oh, they're standing on a stage and this is being dropped into the back, just felt to me like an intentional move to give it that TOS era feel. And I might be wrong. Maybe that was not intentional at all, and it just comes off as being less polished this time. But I like to think anyway that it's actually an artistic move to recreate a feeling for the time.
I think that the most interesting thing here is having Eduardo Sanchez. We don't talk a lot about the directors on the show, but he did the Blair Witch Project. He was the co-director on that. And I think you can absolutely tell that he did, because this has that feeling to it, that an otherworldly camera work feeling, the way we dissolve in and out. I thought that was something that they did a great job of in the episode, where it's this eerie, the way that we're moving the camera, but also the effects we're using with the camera, where we fade in and out, and the sound and everything has such an impact on the representation that you get as you watch the episode. So it had a whole different feel to it than many of the episodes we've had on Strange New Worlds. I think back last year when we had the big Gorn episode where, they're on the ship that had crashed on the ice planet, and the Gorn are chasing them, and it has a very horror feeling. It doesn't quite have a horror feeling, but it does have this very psychological thriller feeling, because we're very disoriented through how we're shooting the episode and the way we're using sound effects and everything else to accentuate that. So to me, all that, they did a very good job on that in this episode.
Yeah, that is a great point about the direction, and also how this show, compared with most other Star Trek series, is very versatile in the way it presents its stories. We've seen it all through season 1, and we're seeing it through season 2. Not only the types of stories that they're telling, but how they tell them visually. They have a lot of room to play in Strange New Worlds, I feel, that we haven't seen in a long time. It reminds me of TOS, actually.
Yeah.
A bit, where you do get different styles from episode to episode.
Can I ask you one question? Because I like that you brought up the classic Trek feel. And I was talking to a friend of mine, and he mentioned that he felt like this episode felt so very similar to This Side of Paradise, but almost like an alternate version of that episode. So I was wondering if you got that feeling at all watching the episode, that it kind of felt like a Twisted Sister version.
I didn't think about it, but now that you mention it, I can certainly see what they're saying. There is this idea, certainly, of if you can forget the real world and you can just be happy by not knowing. I can see that connection to it. Sure.
Yeah, it was just it did very much feel, after they said that, like, oh, no, I can totally see how this is, I would say, a darker version of that story, right? I think obviously This Side of Paradise is actually much more about a kind of drug culture than it is necessarily what this is kind of a more politically and, I think, historically based idea, because, and you mentioned this here in our outline, but this is a story about how the story of our life matters, which basically is something we've talked about ad nauseum on Trek FM through the 602 Club and all the shows here about Star Trek, which is history matters. Like the experiences we have, who we are, all of those things matter because it's what makes us who we are. And without them, we wouldn't be. And again, as we talked about last week, I thought it was interesting that 2 weeks in a row, we're basically nailing that point that Kirk makes in Star Trek V. I need my pain. And that without those things, good and bad, we're not who we are. And so I just found it fascinating that, again, 2 weeks in a row, we're basically banging the same drum.
Yeah. The first time I watched this, I was kind of on the edge of my seat listening to the dialogue because...
Yes.
Like, if I just watch the visuals, if I just watch the story on a very superficial level, it was kind of... It's an episode of Star Trek, but it's definitely not... It didn't feel like it's on par with what we've been getting. But if you listen to the dialogue and you really think about what is being said by Pike, what's being said by Luke, this field Kalar, who is sort of their guide through the situation. It was quite deep, and there are many layers to it, and there's the personal level, the story of your life matters.
Right.
There's the societal level, I think, of how people behave today. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment. And also governmental level, and in the way of like controlling the masses. So there were a lot of things going on here. And I felt like Kirsten and Davey were really trying to tell a deep story, but you need to pay attention to it. Otherwise, it kind of gets lost in the overall presentation of the story. And I've noticed that in a lot of the comments that I've seen about this episode, where people seem to have missed the actual messages in the episode, and they're very fixated on the set design, which of course we just spent time talking about, or, you know, other aspects or decisions that Spock made or things like that.
Yeah.
Your friend mentioning This Side of Paradise, it's also interesting that the title of this episode, Among the Locust Eaters, is a reference to the Odyssey by Homer, where the crew, they go to an island, and there's a fruit there from the lotus tree, and they eat this fruit and they forget all their worries. And in this episode, there's not fruit of the lotus tree, but there's fruit of the gods. And we actually see Luke show Pike and M'Benga on the fruit and explain they eat it and what it does and all. So there's this very clear parallel being drawn here to Homer. And speaking of Luke, I also feel like, I said you need to really pay attention to the dialogue. I also feel like this story was saved by the performance of Reed Birney, who played Luke, because if it weren't for him and the very moving and kind of sad and disconnected performance that he gave, and he's a Tony Award-winning actor, he's very good, I'm not sure that the message that they were trying to get across in this episode would have landed, because you needed someone to guide you through it and be an anchor in presenting the themes.
Mm-hmm. I could not agree with you more, because I do think, like you said, that the presentation of the thematic elements does get slightly muddy throughout the episode.
It does, yeah.
But what's so interesting is the contrast that we're giving here, which is basically a contrast, I think, of our world, which is there's a segment of the population that's basically saying, only live in the moment, only live by your feelings, forget everything else, nothing else matters. And then there's, I think, the rest of us who realize that no, feelings are only a part of the matter, right? Again, as Spock has said, and I've brought up many times throughout talking about Strange New Worlds, logic is only the beginning of wisdom. Well, feelings is only a part of wisdom as well. It's the merging of these things that makes wisdom happen. But it's wisdom comes through logic, emotion, and experience and time. And if you take out experience from that, and you take out logic, and you're only left with emotion, you end up in a place where you are never going to be settled. You're never going to feel complete or whole, because you are missing a huge key to what life is all about and what makes life truly, I think, mean something, worth living. And so I appreciate what the episode is trying to do, and I think absolutely it's the performance there that makes that come to light in a way that it needs. I wish that it was slightly clearer by the end of the episode that that's what they're saying, right?
Right, yeah.
Because I think the importance at the end, you know, and it's La'an that says it, right? Maybe the painful memories are worth it because of the other memories we have, right? And that's the trade-off. And yet I just feel like it almost needed to be stronger and a little bit more of like a, this seems like one of those places where, TOS would have hit this pretty hard, right? Because TOS was not afraid to be preachy. Mm-hmm. And I feel like this was actually a message that needs to be heard more clearly. And I do wish it was hit a little bit harder.
Yeah, no, it does. And here are some thoughts I jotted down in my notes the second time through, because I was so captivated by the dialogue the first time. I needed to go back, listen to it again, process what I thought about it. And Luke keeps talking about this totem. And when he first mentions it, I'm thinking of something like in Inception, like the top, something to remind you if you're in a dream or you're not. But then when we're in his home, we see that the totem is also like literally a totem pole that's carved with a story. And Pike asks him about it. Pike says, "You keep talking about a totem that explains everything. Where is it?" And he says, "You're standing right next to it. The story of the Kalar. It greets us when we rise and helps make sense of the world." What does it say about the palace? Luke says, "The gods decided long ago that there would be two types of Kalar, those who remember to plan our future and record our past, and those who forget to keep the work of the present continuing." At least the way I interpret that, it felt to me like commentary on social media and 24-hour news and the way that everyone these days, you go to bed, you wake up, first thing you do is check Twitter, check Facebook, check CNN or Fox News or whatever it is that you read, and you're being fed information by people who want you to believe one thing. And instead of thinking for yourself, and I'm not saying you can't consume this stuff and still think for yourself, but so many people don't think for themselves. They just wake up, someone tells them what to think for the day. They go through their day, they go to bed, and they wake up, and they do the same thing again. And the people who are shaping the messages, shaping the story that we read and we allow to guide our lives, they're doing it most often for some purpose. And then everyday people are forgetting the history, they're just living in the moment so that, as Luke says here, the work of the present can continue. So just the everyday, we can just keep moving without having to think about where we came from, what happened in the past. That's why we don't learn from history. That's why we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over. So I felt like this was some of the commentary that they were maybe trying to get across through the idea of the forgetting and the totem.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think because I think it connects very much with what I was saying before. What those things do and how we control masses is by keeping them emotionally based and nothing else. So if we can drive their emotions where we want them, then we can control people. And
they make the point in this episode that emotions don't go away as a result of this radiation.
So when people become non-thinking emotion automatons, then that's what we end up with, is an easily controllable mass, right? But also, you'll notice here, just like Big Brother in 1984, we control the language, right?
Right.
And so it's those two things together. It's emotionalism and it's controlling language. And if you're not seeing that today, then you're not paying attention. And I 100% agree with you. That's exactly, I think, again, where this episode is right on target. And where I agree with you, where I just wish that it really found a way to key into those themes just a little bit more and made them a little bit more poignant in the episode, because I honestly just can't imagine better social commentary for Star Trek right now than that.
Yeah. No, I think the commentary is spot on for the time we're living in. But I do agree with you that it's a bit soft and a bit muddy. And especially to really reach the broad audience, it needs to cut through more than it does in this episode, because you can't really expect everyone to watch the episode multiple times. You can't expect everyone to be digging for that social message. You and I, we analyze this stuff. It's what we do. So we're a little bit more tuned into it, I think, than the everyday viewer would be. And I think that's why I would say the overall feeling that I've seen about this episode is that it was a miss. I even saw one writer who did a review and said that, it's not a fatal error for the series, because the series has the ability to change its genre and style from week to week. But they were implying that if this were a typical TV series, that this episode would have possibly been a killer for it because it was such a miss. And I just felt like, if that's your read, I don't think you're really seeing the core of what Star Trek has always been from the very beginning, because I think this episode is very true to what Star Trek is here for, which is social commentary. It just doesn't quite do it in the direct way that we're accustomed to from the original series and some episodes beyond that, but particularly TOS.
Yeah. No, I would not agree at all that this is a miss. I mean, I think there's been other episodes this season that I have felt like have missed more than this. I think
it depends on what you're looking for in Star Trek, but yeah.
Yeah. I honestly, for me personally, the episode that missed the most so far was actually the second episode. And I know a lot of people just absolutely adored that episode, but I found it to be much more problematic story-wise, and even just with the way that it was portraying things and trying to get its point across than this does. And I felt like that really missed the mark on that, whereas this, I feel like, is a soft miss in the sense that I think it's there. It just doesn't hit it as directly as I would have liked it to, but the messages are still there, and I think they're still easily discernible. And I think one of the things we could talk about a little bit was that because this is similar to something that Trek has already done before with This Side of Paradise and other episodes kind of like this, and even the one that just came before this, where we're kind of talking about how much history matters, our past matters, maybe that's why some people might feel that just feels slightly redundant thematically.
Yeah. Well, and it's like episodes like Conundrum on TNG, where the crew forget where they are, who they are. It's similar to that, and that's not the only one. We've had other episodes where the crew can't quite remember things. So it does mix a lot of familiar elements of Star Trek together, for sure. One thing that I did like about that, though, that it enabled them to do in this episode is that they actually used the ensemble cast instead of pushing different characters to the side for the week, which they've so often done.
No, I agree with that. I love the fact that we kind of got a chance to use everybody in the episode. But on top of that, though, Chris, I actually really enjoyed the fact that we kind of dove into the romance between Captain Pike and Captain Patel. I thought that was great, and especially since we're dealing honestly with the struggle it would be to be starship captains and to be in a relationship. This is something I think Enterprise would have probably hit very well with Erica Hernandez and Archer. But yeah, the resolution to it being Pike realizing, one, that, what she means to him, but two, who else is going to understand the reality of their life better than another starship captain is going to understand that there are going to be so many times where all of these other things have to come first before their relationship because of the position that they're in. Nobody else is going to get that like another starship captain is. And so I really appreciated that. I thought that they did it really well. And I like the chemistry between the two actors. And I just also appreciated, too, that we got a chance to see more of Captain Pike, in this episode. I think sometimes he falls a little bit too much by the wayside with the other characters. And I kind of want more episodes to give us more of the captain. And so using his relationship and his conversations, with number one about that, and then his struggle on the planet, I thought all that was great.
Yeah, it's very true that as captains, they can understand each other's situation. And I think it would be very hard for either of them to be in a relationship with someone else. We haven't seen that very often, right? I mean, Sisko, he had the relationship with Cassidy, but that was a situation where they're both in the same place a majority of the time, right? Which can't happen with starship captains very much. So that makes sense. And also, I think that their relationship and the chemistry, as you mentioned, between the actors and the way it's all played feels realistic. It feels like an actual relationship. It feels like they've probably been together for a long time. I don't think this is the first bump in the road that they've had, but they want to be together. And I also think that this element of the story works in a couple of ways. First, it gives us that soft continuity in the series where even though every episode is a standalone story, we do have these threads and personal lives of the characters that run through the series, which I feel are important, gives us that Enterprise feel a good bit. And for this story specifically, and you don't realize it until you get to the end, but setting up this story at the beginning with this relationship situation and break that they decide to take, or that Pike decides to take, really, it was his idea. Being able to come back to that at the end of the episode after all of his interactions with Luke and his experiences on the planet, and this realization that, as we said earlier, the story of your life matters. People matter, relationships matter, emotions matter, and he's able to come back at the end as a result of this experience and realize that Una is right in what she says at the beginning, that why are you going to torpedo this? You push people away. He realizes that he shouldn't do that. And the realization comes not because of what Una says to him, but because of what happened to him on the planet.
Right.
And so this element works very nicely as a bookend for that story to actually have the story and have the experience mean something long-lasting to the character, rather than it just being something that happens on a mission and, okay, it's done, and then let's go on to the next one. There's actually a lasting benefit for Pike here.
Right. No, I couldn't agree with you more, and it's really one of the things where I hope that we will continue to, see that in the series. And, I think that's one of the things that makes this series interesting is being able to see Captain Pike, get to know him more, right? Before the accident happens. And, I think the other strong thing about his storyline is where when he's talking to Zac at the end and he's saying, no, this planet doesn't change people. Mm-hmm. It's you that made the choice to change. And you can't blame me for the choices that you made after you accidentally got left here. And it reminded me of another really important theme that I think this episode really hits very hard, which is, and that was one I thought was pretty blatant, which was stop playing the victim game. Stop blaming everybody else for your own mistakes and your own choices, because you're responsible for the choices you make, regardless of the position you are in your life. There are obviously always going to be situational elements that you can't control, but you can control what you do with the choices you are given and the time you are given, as Gandalf would say. And Zac chose very unwisely here. And I really appreciated that theme as well.
One last thing I want to mention before we move on to the next topic. We're talking about earlier controlling the masses. And there was another bit in here in exchange. This one's between La'an and Pike, but this one also really stood out to me. And La'an, they're looking at the guards, and La'an says, we could overtake them, but it doesn't look like anyone else wants to fight back. And Pike says they've been conditioned. Maybe one day you fight, the next day you forget why, you give up. And I also felt like that was timely commentary on how, whether it's the government or whether it's mob mentality and people ganging up on you for having one thought, in today's world, you often get beaten down, or people try to beat you down to suppress your voice. So you no longer stand up for what you believe in. And then, as we talked about earlier, it makes it easier for the world to go the way they want it to be. Well, you just forget and go along day to day so things can continue. So that's one other bit that I also wish had stood out a little bit more. But so let's talk about Spock a little bit, because I've also seen some questions about how Spock is portrayed here and the choices that he makes by not moving the ship further away from the planet. But as the story goes along, I think that initially he's making what he believes is the right decision, because he does rattle off. It comes a bit before, and then they call back to it indirectly. He rattles off the composition of the debris field. And there are these 3 unknown elements in the debris field, and along with 67% iron, 80% nickel, and some detectable magnesium and radium. There are actually at least 3 unidentified elements. There may be more. But he believes that the properties of the debris field offer protection from the radiation. And when he asks Una for permission to move the ship away, she tells him, don't move us too far away. And so he's really following the orders of his superior officer, and also basing the decision on what he thinks is offering protection to the ship. So I don't think that the decision that he makes is a bad one, although it turns out to be the wrong one, because we find out at the end, and Ortegas puts this in her log, it turns out that the cause of the problem were the unidentified elements in the debris field in the first place. And she says he still has a lot to learn. But what did you think about Spock's actions and the presentation of him in the writing in this episode?
I think it's very clear, obviously, from what they do with the, previously on. They're hinting at the way in which Spock has been subtly growing emotionally, and the fact that he still has not found any kind of equilibrium in that. And, I think it's one of those things, like, what really happens here is Spock kind of plays the hunch that the debris field from the moons is actually going to protect the crew. And I think it's a pretty logical deduction that it would, and it might.
See, and I also thought that he felt that way in part because they had been to this planet before, 5 years earlier, and he already had some familiarity with the environment.
100%. 100%. And so I could not agree with you more in that. And I think...
Turns out he was wrong.
Right. Exactly. What I think is interesting here about this, and to me, this is what's most fascinating. And I'll just come back to something I've hit before. I think that this version of Spock definitely plays much better if it's not Prime Spock, because I feel like we are doing too much emotional work with Spock too early. And, the work of turning Spock into the person we get by the end of Star Trek VI, or in Star Trek VI, is such a long process. And this is accelerating that type of growth very quickly in the sense of him really coming to wrestle with these emotions and understanding human emotions and the way in which that all works and his interactions with people and everything. It doesn't feel like it fits, but I am really enjoying just seeing us play with this character in that way. So I'm not dinging the episode for that. I'm just saying I think it plays better in that way.
Yeah.
And I'm enjoying it. I think Ethan Peck's performance as Spock is really fun. It reminds me of, and it feels like Leonard Nimoy and Zachary Quinto kind of had a baby. And that's the Spock we're getting here, because it's a combination of both of the ways in which they played Spock, I think. And then you're kind of adding on top his own kind of interpretation of that. And so, that's one of the things I enjoy the characters here on the series. I think I think in some ways they're probably written too modern. The vernacular specifically is way too modern, especially to fit within Star Trek as well. But I think, to me, they are fun characters that I'm enjoying seeing grow just for their growth on this show, regardless of how it fits with anything else. It's hard, and I've talked about it before, but I'm trying my best to take Strange New Worlds only on Strange New Worlds value and forget everything else in some ways. So in some ways, it's the antithesis of what we've been talking about, the theme of this episode, which is like we have to have history. In this show, I almost feel like it's better if there isn't history, because it makes the characters easier and more fun to just be able to follow along and see what their growth is going to be, regardless of how it fits with everything else we know.
Yeah. Yeah, my take on Spock is a bit different. I agree, Ethan Peck's performance is excellent. I really like his Spock a lot. I think the emotional aspects of Spock and the way he's being presented here, for me, I think they work pretty well as a progression of the Spock that we saw in season 2 of Discovery, with the show being a spinoff of that season. Everything that happened to Spock during that Red Angel story, and the ultimate way that he became intertwined again with his sister, I feel like the Spock that we're seeing right now, along with the unleashing of emotions that happened with the Gorn encounter in season 1, all come together in a way that makes sense for me, that this is how this character would be acting right now. And I think that there's plenty of room for them to build his journey to explore emotion a bit more, which I know many viewers feel is too emotional right now, but then come to terms with that and come back to the logical side a bit more, which could happen through a range of encounters that could come this season or next season or beyond, and eventually get us to the Spock that we're familiar with by the time that he needs to get there. I think they can do it. I just feel that the presentation right now works with the emotion because of the basis of this character and how this series came to be in the first place. But that's my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see that. And again, I think it's one of those places where they absolutely can do that. It does feel like that they are kind of writing themselves into a hole that they're going to have to dig themselves out of later. And so the further you go, the harder it is to get out of that hole. And so can they do it? I don't know, maybe. But again, I find
they can just get Ortegas to, shoot laser beams into the hole.
Oh, yeah.
And create another hole, and they could just fly right through it with logical Spock. So
yeah. But I think that this is one of the things that's like just trying to take the show on its own value and just base it against itself is really helpful for me to be able to do. And it makes it easier to enjoy the show in that way. So in the end, as long as you're finding a way to enjoy the show, doesn't really matter anything else, So
yeah, that's a good point. One last thing I want to ask you about before we wrap up here. This really stood out to me. At the end, Spock says to Pike, "You are certain this is not a violation of the Prime Directive, sir," as they're getting ready to move debris away from the planet. And Pike says, "A single asteroid changed the course of history on this planet for thousands of years. That's not natural development." Spock says, "Your logic feels sound to me." And in my notes, I have in all capital letters, WHAT, question mark, exclamation mark, 3 times. What? That is the very definition of natural development. Am I wrong? If an asteroid hit the planet and changed the course of evolution or civilization on that planet, is that not a natural occurrence? Is that not the natural course of development on that planet?
I think that it is the sense of natural development when we think of an evolutionary view of nature, right? Where there is nobody in control and it's just like that would, yes, be the very definition of a natural evolution. So what he says makes absolutely no sense.
Because within Star Trek, the Prime Directive and the natural evolution of society is based on science and based on astronomical events or whatever were to happen like that, right? That is the traditional basis of natural development in the Prime Directive in Star Trek.
It's based off of a materialistic view of the world and the universe. Sure. Under 100%. And so what he's saying is akin to being like, maybe there's something more to the universe than meets the eye. And so this really isn't, It does fly in the face of everything we've ever seen in Star Trek, really, right. Except for maybe Deep Space Nine, where we have gods intervening with things. So
yeah, sure, yeah, and so certainly, we don't know what's really out there in the universe. Who knows? But in this situation, because it's Star Trek, and he's the captain of the Enterprise, and he's a human, when the asteroid hit Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs and allowed mammals to evolve and eventually humans to evolve and eventually create starships and Starfleet, and then now he's the captain of the Enterprise. If aliens had decided that, that asteroid hitting Earth, that's not natural development, let's see if we can undo some of that damage. To me, it was a very, very odd statement from a Starfleet captain in Star Trek related to the Prime Directive.
What's interesting is that it feels like a decision Kirk would have made, right? Mm-hmm. Like where Kirk would have just put his own spin on things. And I think that's the thing about this show, right? Is that I don't feel like it's earned that for Pike. Right? Kirk, we would have been like, oh, yeah, of course, that's the Kirk thing to do. You do what you think is best because that's what Star Trek ship captains do. And so by saying that, what he does about natural development and everything, it's like, you're kind of trying to BS your way into this, and that just doesn't make sense. So, like, why don't you just grow a pair and own up to the fact that you're changing the development of this planet because you don't think it's right for people to have to suffer like this? And in the end, Starfleet has irreparably changed the development of this planet anyway. And so why not then basically finish the job? That's what he should have said.
Yeah. And that would have made more sense for me, is that, well, we've already kind of messed things up anyway, so let's try to fix it. Although it could be one of those situations where like you keep trying to fix the problem and then a new problem arises. But anyway, it really stood out to me.
Yeah.
It's a very odd ending of the episode.
Yes, I'm glad that you pointed that out because it is It's weird because that's another place where I feel like the writing is just slightly off, right? Where it's just there's that line needed to be rewritten.
Yeah. But mentioning Kirk, though, it does remind me another thing that I noted is that here Pike states that Starfleet knows the Enterprise needs to go and clean up its mess, which is in contrast to what we always say about the original series, where Starfleet has this little cleanup ship that trails the Enterprise and swoops in and cleans up whatever Kirk did after the Enterprise leaves. So at least here they're going in and
isn't that basically what the California class is for?
Yeah, that's exactly.
So
exactly. All right. Well, what are your final thoughts and what's your rating on this one?
I like this episode. I enjoyed this episode. I didn't love this episode for many of the reasons that I think we've already been through. I think it's still enjoyable. Rewatching it a couple of times to get ready for this podcast. It's not like I hated watching it or anything, and so I'm going to give this 3.5 out of 5 super snazzy helmets because the helmets are supreme.
That's right. Yeah, I also like this episode a lot. I really like the commentary in it because that's what I'm here for in Star Trek and always have been. I will agree with what Uhura says. It's definitely not the oatmeal because it's not the oatmeal causing the problem. And also the commentary here is not bland like oatmeal, but you do have to stir it around a bit to really get to the good parts. But I think it was a clever idea, great concept to go back and revisit events that we hear about in the cage, connecting Pike's story. Even though I said that I think that it's very obvious that they're standing on a stage and you've got this backdrop behind them, I do like the updated images of Rigel VII. I think that the moment when they first lay eyes on the palace, the moon in the distance, it's a very nice callback to Pike's memory of Rigel VII in the cage with a modern feel to it. I thought it was very nicely done. And I guess one message I would just have for people who are analyzing this episode and some of the discourse that I've been seeing about it is that put it into the context of what the writers intended for the story, because I do wonder how many viewers, because, it's quite fashionable these days for many people to say, I've never seen the original series and I can't watch it. I just can't watch it. And so I wonder how many viewers are unaware that this is a sequel of sorts to The Cage and that it's telling some backstory for events that we've heard about before. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when you watch it because it definitely will change how you interpret what you're seeing and how you receive the story. But no, I think it's certainly not the greatest episode of Star Trek or Strange New Worlds that they've made, but it's still a very good episode. I think it's very true to Star Trek. And I'm going to give it 6 unknown elements from the debris field.
Nice.
Well, everyone, we would love to hear your thoughts on Among the Lotus Eaters. There are many ways for you to share those with us. Perhaps the best way is to go to Facebook and join the Babel Conference. That is our listeners group. It's there to extend the conversations beyond the podcasts, so it is a closed group. If you're joining for the first time, please do answer the questions and agree to the rules of the forum so that I can let you in. You'll find a post for this episode there on the timeline, and you can share your thoughts with Matthew and me and fellow listeners. And we have been getting some great discussion about Strange New Worlds on there, so I hope you'll join in. You can also send us email. Go to our website, trek.fm/contact. Use the form you find there. Choose to send to a show and choose Saddle Up, and your message will mosey its way right on over to Matthew and me. And of course, you can find us on social media. Our username everywhere, including on Threads, is TrekFM. Now, Matthew, when you're not a hot mess of wind shear, exotic radiation, and heavy particles, where can people find you?
Well, gosh, Chris, man, it definitely takes up so much of my time to try and not be that. But you can find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and Vero, plus all of the other sundry social medias there are these days. It feels like there's a new one every single day. You can also find
there
me.
Is.
Yeah. Oh, geez. You can find me here on the network on the 602 Club, talking about all of the different fandoms we love outside of Star Trek. In fact, this week, to celebrate my birthday, we're talking about one of my absolute all-time favorite films of all time, Casablanca. So check that out. You can find me as well on Literary Treks, The Orb, Warp 5, and The Artificial Tango. You can also find me over on the Nerd Party Network with a couple of shows. One is Owlpost with Dre Kaufman, talking about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, as well as Aggressive Negotiations, talking with John Mills about Star Wars each and every week. Now, Chris, when you're not trying to remember exactly how to pilot the ship, where can people find you?
Come on, Matthew, help me remember. Help me. Are you ready? Come on. I fly the ship. I fly the ship. I fly the ship. Now, you can find me elsewhere on the network, as you mentioned, with you, doing all those shows together. Larry Nemechek and I do the Ready Room from time to time. There's Interphase. You can find me in lots of episodes in the back catalog across a range of shows. And you can also find me in social media. My username everywhere is C. Bryan Jones, letter C and Bryan with a Y. Twitter's where I'm most active. I'm getting more active on Threads. And as Matthew mentioned, there is a new social media network every day, so you might find me there too. Wherever you are, I'd love to chat with you. Again, C. Bryan Jones, the letter C, and Bryan with a Y. And if you'd like to help us keep this show and everything we're doing in the network going, we could definitely use your help. To find out how to support us, please visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM. I want to send a huge thank you to everyone who's supporting us now. We would not be here without you. And if you're not, we do hope you will decide to do so. Well, Matthew, as Pike says in this episode, hold on to your saddle, because we'll have another discussion coming up next week.
Well, Chris, I can't wait to get to the next episode, Charades, so hit it.
Matthew, listeners are going to have trouble with this next episode of Saddle Up, though, since we're going to be doing it all with our hands through charades.